America's Two Just Wars, 1775 and 1861, by Murray N. Rothbard. This article is composed from notes used by the author in his presentation at the Mises Institute's Costs of War Conference in Atlanta, May 20th to the 22nd, 1994. Much of classical international law theory, developed by the Catholic scholastics, notably the 16th century Spanish scholastics such as Vittoria and Suarez, and then the Dutch Protestant scholastic Grotius, and by 18th and 19th century jurists, was an explanation of the criteria for a just war. For war, as a grave act of killing, needs to be justified. My own view of war can be put simply. A just war exists when a people tries to ward off the threat of coercive domination by another people, or to overthrow an already existing domination. A war is unjust, on the other hand, when a people try to impose domination on another people, or try to retain an already existing coercive rule over them. During my lifetime, my ideological and political activism has focused on opposition to America's wars. First, because I have believed our waging them to be unjust, and second, because war, in the penetrating phrase of the libertarian Randolph Bourne in World War I, has always been the health of the state, an instrument for the aggrandizement of state power over the health, the lives, and the prosperity of their subject citizens and social institutions. Even a just war cannot be entered into lightly. An unjust one must therefore be anathema. There have been only 2 wars in American history that were, in my view, assuredly and unquestionably proper and just. Not only that, the opposing side waged a war that was clearly and notably unjust. Why? Because we did not have to question whether a threat against our liberty and property was clear or present. In both of these wars, Americans were trying to rid themselves of an unwanted domination by another people. And in both cases, the other side ferociously tried to maintain their coercive rule over Americans. In each case, one side, our side if you will, was notably just, the other side, their side, unjust. To be specific, the 2 just wars in American history were the American Revolution and the War for Southern Independence. I would like to mention a few vital features of the treatment of war by the classical international natural lawyers, and to contrast this great tradition with the very different international law that has been dominant since 1914 by the dominant partisans of the League of Nations in the United Nations. The classical international lawyers from the 16th through the 19th centuries were trying to cope with the implications of the rise and dominance of the modern nation-state. They did not seek to abolish war, the very notion of which they would have considered absurd and utopian. Wars will always exist among groups, peoples, nations. The desideratum, in addition to trying to persuade them to stay within the compass of just wars, was to curb and limit the impact of existing wars as much as possible. Not to try to abolish war, but to constrain war with limitations imposed by civilization. Specifically, the classical international lawyers developed 2 ideas which they were broadly successful in getting nations to adopt. 1. Above all, don't target civilians. If you must fight, let the rulers and their loyal or hired retainers slug it out, but keep civilians on both sides out of it as much as possible. The growth of democracy, the identification of citizens with the state, conscription, and the idea of a nation in arms all whittled away this excellent tenet of international law. 2. Preserve the rights of neutral states and nations. In the modern corruption of international law that has prevailed since 1914, neutrality has been treated as somehow deeply immoral. Nowadays, if countries A and B get into a fight, it becomes every nation's moral obligation to figure out, quickly, which country is the bad guy, and then if, say, A is condemned as the bad guy, to rush in and pummel A in the defense of the alleged good guy B. Classical international law, which should be brought back as quickly as possible, was virtually the opposite. In a theory which tried to limit war, neutrality was considered not only justifiable, but a positive virtue. In the old days, he kept us out of war, was high tribute to a president or political leader, but now, all the pundits and professors condemn any president who stands idly by while people are being killed in Bosnia, Somalia, Rwanda, or the hot spot of the day. In the old days, standing idly by was considered a mark of high statesmanship. Not only that, neutral states had rights which were mainly upheld, since every warring country knew that someday it too would be neutral. A warring state could not interfere with neutral shipping to an enemy state. Neutrals could ship to such an enemy with impunity all goods except contraband, which was strictly defined as arms and ammunition, period. Wars were kept limited in those days, and neutrality was extolled. In modern international law, where bad guy nations must be identified quickly and then fought by all, there are two rationales for such worldwide action, both developed by Woodrow Wilson, whose foreign policy and vision of international affairs has been adopted by every president since. The first is collective security against aggression. The notion is that every war, no matter what, must have one aggressor and one or more victims, so that naming the aggressor becomes a prelude to a defense of heroic little victims. The analogy is with the cop on the corner. A policeman sees A mugging B. He rushes after the aggressor, and the rest of the citizens join in the pursuit. In the same way, supposedly, nations, as they band together in collective security arrangements, whether they be the League, the United Nations, or NATO, identify the aggressor nation and then join together as an international police force, like the cop on the corner, to zap the criminal. In real life, however, it's not so easy to identify one warring aggressor. Causes become tangled and history intervenes. Above all, a nation's current border cannot be considered as evidently just as a person's life and property. Therein lies the problem. How about the very different borders 10 years, 20 years, or even centuries ago? How about wars where claims of all sides are plausible? But any complication of this sort messes up the plans of our professional war crowd. To get Americans stirred up about intervening in a war thousands of miles away, about which they know nothing and care less, one side must be depicted as the clear-cut bad guy, and the other side pure and good. Otherwise, Americans will not be moved to intervene in a war that is really none of their business. Thus, feverish attempts made by American pundits and alleged foreign policy experts to get us to intervene against the demonized Serbs ran aground when the public began to realize that all three sides in the Bosnian War were engaging in ethnic cleansing whenever they got the chance. This is even forgetting the fatuity of the propaganda about the territorial integrity of a so-called Bosnian state, which has never existed even formally until a year or two ago, and of course in actuality does not exist at all. If classical international law limited and checked warfare and kept it from spreading, modern international law, and an attempt to stamp out aggression and to abolish war only ensures, as the great historian Charles Beard put it, a futile policy of perpetual war for perpetual peace. End of part 1.